Good day traders, welcome to this week's RMD Weekly Market Overview. This week we will look at how some of our calls from last week played out, especially on the NASDAQ and Bitcoin, and we will also look at some really good potential setups on the USDZAR and Brent crude. This will be along with our usual lineup of markets that we cover. I'm going to let the disclaimer roll and I'll see you in the charts. Looking at the US dollar to South African rand, last week saw the breakdown that we were expecting with this breach of the lower diagonal. That took us lower to firstly our target, which we set at 16 rand 40 to the dollar, and then we went even lower towards the weekly S3 pivot at 16.10. For this week, what we are expecting is, in considering that we are now in a bearish trend with all the major moving averages pointing down, as you can see, we are expecting more bearish price action. However, it does appear that we have, at least for now, broken above this falling wedge formation. That means we could perhaps see price move higher towards this first area of resistance, that is at our monthly S1 pivot and also our weekly pivot between 1638 and 1640. And then perhaps a bit higher towards our yearly R2 pivot at 1655, also coinciding with the current 200 daily SMA at 1658, and that will also coincide with the breakdown level that we've seen. There's also some additional resistance should we move this high to 1668, that's the weekly R1 pivot, also coinciding with the 4-hour 100 SMA, which has been a dynamic area of resistance for the last couple of weeks. So any negative or bearish price action from any of these levels will very likely take price back lower, and the immediate areas of support would be our weekly S1 pivot at 1601, and that would be followed by the area between 1572 and 1585, and I'll have to go to a higher time frame to show you that, and let me just go to the daily time frame. So there you can see those lower areas of support should price move that low. We are now moving on to the EURUSD. We're looking at the 4-hour chart. Last week saw price continue its consolidation, testing both our bullish and bearish targets that we set in our video last week, that were both at this diagonal boundary. So we tested the diagonal boundary over here as well as over there. Currently, we can see that price is still respecting this 4-hour 200 SMA, with price closing above it on Friday. So for this week, I think it's important to keep an eye out on this weekly pivot level at 1.182. That is also coinciding with the 4-hour 200 SMA. Entry close above that and also above our monthly pivot especially will likely take us firstly to this weekly R1 pivot at 1.191, being the first area of resistance. And if that breaks, we will expect price to move higher towards our weekly R2 pivot at 1.198, also coinciding with that previous high. Should we reject this weekly pivot at 1.182, I think we will likely retest the lower diagonal, and depending on where that holds or not, if that does break down, we will move lower, likely below our weekly S1 pivot and lower to this area between the major horizontal support at 1.162 and its weekly S2 pivot at 1.166. Looking at the economic calendar for the week, quite a lot of medium to high impact events, but not too much to get excited about. We can see that later today we have the Federal Chair speaking. The same goes for Tuesday at 4:30, and then there are some more Federal Chair testifying, and of course crude inventories at 4:30 on Wednesday. And on Thursday we have our unemployment claims at 2:30, and affecting the GBP would be the Bank of England governor speaking at 4 o'clock, followed by the Federal Chair Powell speaking again, and also the Treasury Secretary. On Friday, there is some core durable goods figures coming out at 2:30. So just keep an eye on those and remember to manage your risk. And moving on to the GBPUSD, last week saw very much muted price action with just a slight recovery from the oversold condition, with bearish trend remaining in place. I'm still expecting a correction towards this 1.310 area. That is where we will find our 4-hour 100 as well as our 4-hour 200 SMAs, all converging on this monthly S1 pivot area. It's also the area that we mentioned on our weekly video last week as an area of potential correction, being a major level that has not yet been retested. Any bullish price action above our weekly pivot and above this lower diagonal will likely see that play out. Also, of course, pending a close above this 1.300 level, which coincides with this major area of resistance and also the previous area of resistance that we saw over here, and also coinciding with the weekly R1 pivot at 1.302. However, should we see a close below this weekly pivot and also a close, we can see this dynamic 50 SMA in the 4-hour. If we see a close below that, I expect we will see a move lower toward our weekly S1 pivot at 1.279, followed by this weekly area of major support, which is at our weekly S2 near 1.272. And moving on to the Australian dollar USD. Last week saw another test of this upper diagonal boundary, with price reverting back towards the monthly pivot, around which it has been consolidating for almost 3 weeks now. There is still a bullish tendency, as we can see from our MFI moving lower, in other words, making lower lows, whereas price is actually making higher lows. And also considering our moving averages are mostly pointing upwards. And we can see that price also still trading above this 200 and just in the vicinity of the 50 and 100. Just considering that we are now on this monthly pivot area that will act as this immediate area of support at 0.728. Any bullish price action above that and our weekly pivot at 0.729 would probably see us retest this upper diagonal boundary near 0.735, which is a horizontal resistance. And if we see a bearish price action below this monthly pivot level, I expect us to retest this lower diagonal boundary, and that could be in the area of 0.724. And should we break below that, the first area of support would be the monthly S1 pivot at 0.717, or perhaps just below that, the horizontal support at 0.714. Looking now at the NASDAQ, also known as the US 100. So for those traders who watched our video last week, we mentioned that a break above the diagonal, and that was the one that we had over here, would take us to 11,550, and that is exactly what happened. We also mentioned that a break below this area of support at 11,050 will take us lower towards 10,810, which also happened very near the close of Friday. So with the important support level at 11,050 now broken, we'll likely see price continue lower to the weekly S1 at 10,620, being mindful of this lower diagonal that is now forming. Also considering that a retest of this 11,050 area, or perhaps even slightly above that at our weekly pivot, 11,085, would now be an area of resistance and present a possible short opportunity, as that would now act as resistance. So after that, any rejection from that area will likely take us to this weekly S1 pivot at 10,620, followed by the support area near the weekly S2. And let's zoom out a little bit so you can see the next areas of support would then be in this vicinity of 10,305 to 10,391, and that's the area between our weekly S2 pivot and our monthly S2 pivots. So just considering that a break above, or a close rather, above this diagonal and our weekly pivot would be bullish, and that might then take us back higher towards these higher levels, and especially our weekly R1 pivot at 11,415, coinciding with this 4-hour 200 SMA. We are now looking at the Brent crude oil. Brent crude has again managed to surprise us with its veracity, and as we've mentioned last week, close above the weekly pivot that was at 40.75. We'll perhaps see this 42 level retested, which it did, but it actually went up and corrected all the way back to this 4-hour 200 SMA, which technically does make sense, since that is the major technical level which it has lost and also previously retested. And at this stage, I think we could expect a move lower towards this monthly S2 pivot area at 41.40. Also even retesting initially this weekly pivot at 42.42. However, just to be safe, perhaps just wait for some confirmation with a break below the 4-hour 100 SMA. That should be in the area of about 42.90. If we see a break above this diagonal, which is now formed, and with a confirmation, of course, with a close above the 4-hour 200 SMA, we can perhaps expect price to move back towards this 45.35 level, which is now major horizontal resistance. But just looking at a continued sell-off or the bearish scenario, now should we move below our weekly pivot, followed by our yearly S2 pivot and monthly S2 pivot levels, as you can see over here, that will likely take us back to the lows at 59.90. Looking now at gold, gold is continuing its consolidation within this larger symmetrical triangle. Also currently respecting the very important level of 1950, which is the center, or let's say this pivotal area within this symmetrical triangle. So also keeping in mind that we have our 4-hour 150 SMAs converging at the area of the current close on Friday, and we also have our weekly pivot at 1952, also very close to where we had our close on Friday. So considering the scenario of a bullish breakout, that would mean a confirmed close firstly above this 200 SMA, and ideally, of course, also above our upper diagonal. That could potentially take us higher towards the classic yearly R3 pivot at 2030, but that would be also dependent on a close above our monthly pivot point, as well as this weekly R1 level at 1970. Just considering some bearish scenarios, if we reject from our weekly pivot level and we lose our important 1950 level, we do still have this interim diagonal near about 1940, and should that break, I believe we should see a retest of this widening channel. It's called a megaphone formation, so that would mean we will see a move towards the lower diagonal around 1928, and also meeting up with the larger diagonal support at this same area. We conclude this week's market overview by looking at Bitcoin, and as mentioned on our market overview video last week, we said that if we should see a close above this monthly S1 pivot at $10,650, we will see a retest of the head and shoulders neckline at 10,100. That indeed played out perfectly, and that is also where we then met up with this 4-hour 200 SMA, which does seem to be holding its ground so far. But the big question for this week remains, will we see price move above the 4-hour 200 SMA to retest this monthly pivot at 11,560, or break lower to retest this area of the monthly S1 pivot at 10,650, which is now the area of support? My suggestion would be to keep a close eye on, firstly, this 4-hour 200 SMA. So any bullish price action above that will likely take us higher towards the monthly pivot, and just also keeping in mind this overhead diagonal. And of course, should we break below this 50 SMA in the 4 hour, that's the one that is hiding on our lower diagonal up here, that will then take us to the 10,650 point. But also keeping in mind that should that break, another area of support would be at 10,300. I hope you found this week's video valuable, and as always, we would like to remind you to please subscribe and also select the notification button in order to be reminded as soon as we make new content live. Also, if you want to subscribe to our newsletter where we will send out trade setup ideas on a weekly basis, please visit our website at www.rmdtrader.com. And until next time, this is John Jacobs for RMD Trader. Trade smart and trade successful.